I wonder how many of you have a dog and therefore know very well that at least a couple of times a day it needs to be taken for a walk. The first time is in the morning, often early, because after all, I don't need to tell you what dogs have to do, right? So imagine a big city, let's say it's London, just to set the scene. And imagine the classic middle-aged Londoner walking his dog. Early morning light on a June day. June in London is an almost muggy month, very humid. Sometimes you can feel the heat even if it doesn't go above 27 degrees. So what does our distinguished middle-aged Londoner do? The dog goes for a walk near the Thames, close to the water to get some relief, to avoid the heat already early in the morning. And while walking near the Thames, passing under one of the great monumental bridges that cross the river of the British capital, our gentleman in middle age is drawn to something that emerges from the water. It looks like a bundle. At first he ignores a bundle of rags, but it's odd because it floats. Soon he realizes it's not rags, but a human head. And it's a man, a drowned man, maybe a homeless man, like one of the many who actually crowd the European cities, who sometimes, unfortunately, lose their lives. Maybe because of the cold, an accident, or fights with other homeless people. A tragedy like many others. So our distinguished Londoner goes to the nearest phone booth, calls the emergency number, brings in the paramedics and the bobbies, the police officers, the typical English policemen. And it's at that moment when the police arrive, when the doctors intervene, that the whole corpse of that man is discovered, who didn't exactly drown. Because his head, his neck are held attached to a scaffolding made of metal pipes, so-called innocenti pipes, with a rope tied with a particular knot, a bowline knot, a knot made not to tighten but to hold. And that man is not exactly a homeless person. He can't be because he's clean-shaven. He is because the clothes, even though they were submerged in water for a long time, are of excellent quality. And because in his pockets they find something strange, they find several bricks, stones even tucked into his groin, and something like $15,000. He can't be a homeless man. He's a man who dies in the water with $15,000 on him. No homeless person has that kind of money. Maybe he never even dreamed of it. There's also an identification card. It's Italian. It has the name Roberto, C-A-L-V-I, but that name and the face on the identification card match the face of the dead man, except for a pair of mustaches that the dead man doesn't have, but are present in the photo. It reminds me of another missing person, someone who disappeared from circulation, and nothing has been heard about them for a few days. His name is Roberto Calvi, and he is the president of the largest Catholic bank in Italy, Banco Ambrosiano. He has been missing for days, and his lawyer has reported his sudden disappearance. No one knows where he is until that body is found in the Thames. Dead, but dead how? And why was he in London? Who brought him there? Who helped him disappear into thin air from Italy? Above all, who was he? Roberto Calvi. Roberto Calvi was born in Lombardy, born into the Milanese bourgeoisie on April 13, 1920, the son of a bank employee at the Banca Commerciale Italiana, which ironically was the elite of secular Italian finance at that time, which would later, after the war, be opposed to Catholic finance. Roberto Calvi started by studying at high school, then enrolled at the University of Economics and Commerce. He couldn't complete his studies because in 1940 he was drafted. There's the Second World War. He ends up in the Lancers of Novara, and with the Lancers of Novara he's sent to the Eastern Front in Russia, in the Italian army in Russia, as a cavalry second lieutenant. And on the field, Roberto Calvi proves to be an extremely intelligent but also energetic young man. In fact, he manages to bring his men home almost all safe and sound. At a certain point during the retreat from Russia, he forces them to get off their horses because he sees that they are giving in to the cold and hardship. And to walk to get their blood flowing again, he brings his men home, his boys. When he returns home, he finds Italy changed, but also his welcoming father. First a job at Comet, and then, in fact, at Banco Ambrosiano. The priest's bank, the bank you can only enter by showing your baptism certificate and proof of the other sacraments, and a statement from the priest of your parish confirming your attendance at Mass. A special bank, a bank that is used both in the various dioceses of Italy and by the respectable middle class. They trust that special bank, so attentive to their needs of the Italian upper middle class, especially in a post-war period when banks serve as the financial engine for reconstruction. The so-called economic boom of the mid-1950s and all through the 1960s. This is a period that Roberto Calvi goes through. Initially as a simple employee, then, through his friendship with Alessandro Canesi, who would become general manager and later president of Ambrosiano. Calvi will advance in his career. At 38, he will become Canesi's personal assistant. Then, he quickly climbs the hierarchy, general manager, vice president. In 1975, it's his turn to become president, the president of the largest Catholic bank in Italy. A giant D'Ambrosiano, but as we will see, it's a sick giant, a giant with feet of clay. Because Roberto Calvi made his career by studying together with his mentor, Alessandro Canesi, a mechanism that of offshore tax havens, the establishment abroad of financial holding companies or subsidiaries, or even new banks that communicate with each other and operate by compensating funds. Because Calvi is a wizard with accounts, he understood that to bypass the rules of the banking system, which require a fractional reserve to guarantee the activities of the credit institution, it's enough to let this reserve float from one bank to another in such a way that a bank that might be in slight difficulty can appear to be healthy, only because its accounts include the money deposited in another bank of the same group. It's a mechanism that will lead to self-destruction. But Calvi, at that moment, maybe still doesn't know it. From the late 1960s to 1975, Roberto Calvi develops many friendships. Some are influential friendships, because he is introduced into the so-called inner circle of finance. These are the years of the Agnelli family, the years of the Pacenti family, the years of Mrs. Anna Bonomi Volchini, the lady of Italian finance, the years of the Riva cotton magnates, the years of Istituto per la Ricostruzione Industriale, the years when Italian finance is increasingly looking toward expansion. But these are also the years when some people act like sharks in finance. And it is precisely the encounter with a shark that changes the course of Roberto Calvi's career. This shark lives in Milan, but he is originally from Patti, in the province of Messina. He is a lawyer, but he doesn't exactly practice law. He prefers to be a tax consultant. His name is Michel Sindona. He came to Milan thanks to his work as a consultant and soon became an aggressive banker. As I said, Sindona is a shark, and he is protected, well protected, because behind Sindona, he has his own network of friends made up of the mafia. He belongs to the P2 Lodge, a lodge he joins. After passing through another secret lodge, the Justice and Freedom Lodge, under the Grand Lodge of Italy, which later merges in the September 1973 reunification attempt into the Grand Orient of Italy. And so in the P2 and within the P2, Calvi will find even risky friendships and potential allies. But this is a story that will be addressed shortly. Let's go back to Sindona. As I said, he's a shark. He's a raider, as they say in the business. He's a man with great ambitions. One is to obtain on that huge amount of money in shares, which is inside the belly of the former Italian electric companies. One of these is Centrale Finanziaria, one of the many companies that used to produce electricity in the private sector and that the state nationalized with the founding of Enel in the early 1960s. From then on, the plant, now financial instead of electric, shifted to high finance. However, it never reinvested the money internally. And Sindona takes it out. Then he will set his sights on Bastogi, but he will be defeated and will have to give in to the plant. And who? To whom does he give up this financial holding company? To Roberto Calvi, now Sindona's business partner, and whom Sindona himself, in 1975, introduces to Licio Gelli, the mattress maker from Pistoia, the one who revives the Masonic propaganda lodge and gives it specific characteristics as a business clique and a center of secret plots. Within the P2, Calvi thinks he will find the support he lacks for his final determined climb, the one toward power, especially when the star of Michel Sindona fades in The Hague. The autumn of 1974, with the arrest warrants, with the collapse of the private financial bank, with the crash of the Franklin National Bank, United States of America. Calvi believes in miracles. He believes in the possibility of making a career, of taking Michel Sindona's place. However, he will realize that Michel Sindona was a lemon and had been squeezed dry. And now it's Calvi's turn to be squeezed. By whom? By the usual powerful forces, by the P2, but also by the Mafia, by the Magliana gang, and by many other interests, which also involve the Vatican, because these are the years when Vatican politics has direct implications in finance. The Italian state has now decided, after more than a century, to stop granting concessions to the Vatican state. Various taxes, starting with the property tax, and the Vatican owns about a third of Rome. So it would be a heavy blow to the finances. Not only that, but the Vatican's finances are not doing well. A Monsignor was called from America to fix them. We've already met Father Casimir Marcinkus, and Marcinkus is the new ally, but also the rival of Calvi. This big, burly man who speaks Italian with a very strong American accent, and who convinces Calvi to support, with lots of money, several operations, starting with the transfer of large funds abroad. Funds that go to the Banca del Gottardo in Switzerland. From the Banca del Gottardo, they pass through Luxembourg. From Luxembourg, they arrive at Cisalpine, Overseas Bank of Nassau in the Bahamas, which will later change its name to Banco Ambrosiano Overseas. It's an offshore bank founded by Marcinkus and Calvi. And then from Nassau, the money goes to Lima in Peru to Banco Andino. And Banco Andino has Panamanian companies. Where is every trace of this money lost? And there is a lot of money coming out of Ambrosiano, a huge amount. In the end, it will be over $1 billion. Money that leaves a huge gap at Ambrosiano between the late 70s and early 80s. It faces its first difficulties. There are inspections ordered by the Bank of Italy. And there is also a judicial investigation entrusted to the public prosecutor Emilio Alessandrini. But here something happens. Something that should make us reflect maybe. Why does Alessandrini die? He isn't killed naturally, but by prima linea terrorists. And the reason remains unclear. Far-left terrorists targeted a judge who hadn't put them in their sights. Very strange. And The Bank of Italy is shaken by an earthquake. The general manager, Mario Sarcinelli, is arrested, and the governor, Paolo Baffi, is forced to resign. He avoids prison due to his age. Both of them are accused by magistrates Alibrandi and Infelici of having facilitated an illegal procedure in favor of a bankrupt businessman. That's not true, but it won't be discovered for 4 years. However, in the meantime, the murder of Alessandrini and the earthquake at the Bank of Italy have temporarily halted the problems of the Banco. Ambrosiano. It receives money. It receives money from Internazionale Idrocarburi's offshore banks, like Hydrocarbos, from Banca Nazionale del Lavoro, from Banco di Roma. This is money that's used to temporarily cover the holes that have opened up, but it's never enough because there are always more and more holes. There's also another hole, the one caused by politics, because Roberto Calvi started funding pretty much all the parties. Some have interpreted funding as a repayable loan, gradually repaid. They give the money back. Others, like the Italian Socialist Party, do not return anything, to the point that Calvi has to negotiate with Bettino Craxi, the secretary of the Italian Socialist Party, to find a solution to get that money back. At that moment, the so-called protection account is set up at UBS in Lugano, an account that should be used to channel the money both coming in and going out. Both support the Italian Socialist Party in returning to Ambrosiano, but in the end, it will once again be used to drain resources to a bank that is increasingly in trouble. The last blow, the practically fatal one, because it pushes Roberto Calvi into the arms of even more dangerous friendships, comes in the spring of 1981. On March 17, 1981, the Guardia di Finanza, assigned by the Milanese magistrates Toroni and Colombo, goes to Arezzo, to Via Vanda, and in the offices of Gioli, it is the residence, and these are the workplaces of Licio Gelli. The magistrates are investigating the famous list of 500 a number that represents the major Italian clandestine currency exporters. It would be a list drawn up by Michel Sindona and used as a weapon of blackmail by Sindona himself. But the magistrates and the finance police don't find that list. They find another list, the one of the P2 in which Roberto Calvi is present. Licio Gelli, Umberto Ortolani, and Michele Sindona are clearly present. There are also many military personnel from the armed forces, carabinieri, and secret services. And then there are industrialists, journalists, doctors, and public officials. Roberto Calvi finds himself basically exposed because in that list, besides him and the leaders of the P2, there are also the top executives of Rizzoli. Rizzoli, which was financed by Ambrosiano to purchase the Corriere della Sera. Right. A few weeks earlier, the newspapers had given Roberto Calvi the rather unflattering label of the banker of Via Solferino. This was due to his activity as a banker and the acquisition of the newspaper, whose editorial office was located precisely on Via Solferino in Milan. It had been a significant expense, but according to the aims of the P2, it was supposed to be used to steer public opinion. And besides, during that period, Angelo Rizzoli, president of Rizzoli, Bruno Tassandini, the general manager of Rizzoli, as well as many other prominent figures from the world of print, radio, and television. Let's think of Gustavo Silva, Di Bella, the director of Corsera, but also Maurizio Costanzo. Costanzo is also part of the P2. Then, after the discovery of the lists, the publication of the lists, he will give a memorable interview to the newspaper La Repubblica. Admitting his foolishness, he'll say, "I was an idiot. I let myself be convinced by another journalist and writer, Roberto Gervaso, to join, but I never really believed in it. They embarrassed me." That's how it ends. Thank you all. Calvi, however, 2 months after the lists were found and immediately after their names were revealed, which causes a political earthquake. With the fall of the Forlani government and the formation of the first secular government led by Spadolini, Calvi ends up in handcuffs, and with him, others are also arrested. Mario Valeri Manera, known as Banal Grande, head of Veneto Confindustria, and the entire board of directors of the financial center, that financial company which had almost been given as a poisoned fruit by Sindona. Why are they getting arrested? Because the magistrates discovered that the financial center, through Credito Varesino, one of the banks it controlled, secretly exported capital and carried out incomprehensible operations. Calvi ends up in jail while de Flagra. The P2 scandal erupts. Meanwhile, Pope John Paul II is attacked in St. Peter's Square by the Turk Ali Aksa. And during those weeks in prison, Calvi is torn between speaking or staying silent. His lawyer recommends that he not say anything, but he lets something slip. The magistrates try to put pressure on him, but they only get some mumbling, some revelations, sometimes contradictory, basically nothing useful. When his wife and daughter go to visit him in prison, Calvi gives them a handwritten note which they were supposed to take to Rome. In the offices of the Institute for Religious Works, the note says, this trial is called Institute for Religious Works, Institute for Religious Works. It's a way to point to Marcinkus as the accomplice in everything that's happening at the Ambrosiano, which is heading toward disaster. Calvi also attempts suicide in prison, but it's a half-hearted attempt. He barely injures his wrist with a razor blade and swallows a few pills, but it's enough to succeed. To get out of prison after the first-degree sentence? He doesn't have his passport, though. He can't move. It was revoked, and it will be a big regret for him. Upon leaving prison, Roberto Calvi seems to be a finished man. On the Ambrosiano board, they treat him like a pariah, like a man who doesn't matter anymore, a man who has nothing left to give and who perhaps should resign and step aside. But Calvi doesn't intend to step aside. Calvi wants to fight. Calvi wants to get back the money he gave to the Panamanian companies. And that's why he goes to the Vatican and asks Marcinkus for letters of patronage. Letters in which Marcinkus states that the Panamanian companies that owe more than $1 billion to the Ambrosiano are actually owned by the Vatican. In return, Marcinkus asks Calvi to sign a letter of indemnity. This letter cancels the patronage, as Calvi declares he is solely responsible for everything that happened. Calvi is cornered. The P2 can't help. So he looks for other support, since Marcinkus has put him in front of Amuro. He looks for support in Opus Dei, which at that time is starting a deep internal struggle in the Vatican to gain more and more power. And then he turns to the Magliana gang, to Pippo Calò, the mafia's treasurer, and to Flavio Carboni. We already talked about him a few weeks ago, the real estate developer from Sardinia, the man who claims to be very well connected with Italian finance and to be a close friend of Armandino Corona, the Republican politician who is about to become Grand Master of the Grand Orient of Italy. Calvi tries every direction. He gives it a shot, but he can't get anything out of it. He is even forced to accept appointments to the Ambrosiano board of directors that he doesn't want. People imposed by politics who don't exactly serve Calvi's interests. The situation keeps getting worse. It's spring 1982. One day, Calvi's deputy, Roberto Rossoni, leaves his house. He has to go to work. Rossoni lives near a branch of Banco Ambrosiano. But before getting into his car, he finds himself facing a man with a sharp face, a thick beard, and a helmet on his head. That man points a gun at Rossoni's legs, At first, the weapon jams, he racks it and starts shooting. He fires some shots and Rosone falls wounded, shot in the legs. The shots draw the security guard out into the street, the one who is guarding the Ambrosiano branch. The shooter jumps on a motorcycle with an accomplice, and they escape. The security guard fires some shots from behind. One of these hits the attacker, who falls to the ground dead on the spot. They take off his helmet. Danilo Abruciati is the attacker and a Banda della Magliana boss. From then on, people began asking what the Banda della Magliana had to do with Banco Ambrosiano. Why did a boss like Abruciati personally go to Milan to attempt to kill Rosone? Most importantly, what does Rosone know? Why was he a target? Why is the Armagliana gang after him? Is it because he doesn't launder money, because he's pocketing it, or because he asked uncomfortable questions? Why did he get in the way? Because he doesn't want Banco Ambrosiano and its salvation to depend on dirty money from drug trafficking. These are questions that still don't have a clear answer today. But the attack on Rosone finally opens Roberto Calvi's eyes, and from that moment on, he becomes elusive. He removes himself from many forms of protection, including that of Pazienza. Francesco Pazienza, the head of the Parallel Servizio per le Informazioni e la Sicurezza Militare, a doctor who is actually a spy. He works for General Santovito at Servizio per le Informazioni e la Sicurezza Militare and has created a parallel structure hidden within Servizio per le Informazioni e la Sicurezza Militare itself, and who ultimately works for the P2. Calvi leaves behind almost all of his protectors, except for one, Flavio Carboni. He trusts him, and he relies on Flavio Carboni. In June of 1982, the appeal trial for the financial center issue is approaching. Calvi doesn't have a passport, as we've already mentioned, so he turns to Carboni to find a solution. Carboni advises him to disappear, to go abroad, to leave the country in secret, and he instructs his secretary, those guys, to prepare fake documents, that identification card, that John Roberto Calvini, that no one will believe in the end. But in the end, Roberto Calvi manages to escape. He escapes by having himself driven by car to Trieste, where he is taken on a speedboat by a smuggler, Silvano Vittor, originally from Umago. On that speedboat, Calvi crosses into Yugoslavia. From Koper, he goes up until he enters Austria, in Klagenfurt, where Vittor and Carboni have relationships with two sisters, the Kleinstich sisters, daughters of a timber industrialist. Vittor even had children with his Austrian partner. Along the way, Vittor also managed to convince Roberto Calvi to entrust him with his bag. He never lets go of the bag. The bag that perhaps contains sensitive documents and that actually holds something dangerous for many. It also contains letters that Calvi wrote to Pope John Paul II. Letters in which Calvi says that he was manipulated, that he was convinced to do certain things he didn't want to do. And it also contains something revealing. Calvi writes in those letters that he doesn't want to, but he also won't allow himself to be blackmailed. Calvi realized he was in danger, but he still hadn't understood that he might have trusted the wrong people. Why is it Carboni who convinces Calvi not to go to Switzerland, where Calvi wants to go to recover more documents, more money? And who knows, maybe from there he would leave for the Bahamas. No, Carboni convinces Calvi to leave for London. Of course, the city is a financial hub. But in London, with the excuse of not being recognized, Carboni stays at the Chelsea Cloister, a big residence, rather shabby, where even Calvi himself feels uncomfortable. He asks himself, but also Silvano Vittor, who by now acts as his nanny, if not his jailer, How can a banker like him live in a residence meant for immigrants, low-income workers, sometimes even used by prostitutes and drug dealers? Maybe Roberto Calvi still hasn't realized that he's gotten himself into a trap. Maybe he only understands it at the very end. Meanwhile, Italy's situation is worsening. On June 17, 1982, the board of directors of Banco Ambrosiano holds an emergency meeting. It decides, on the proposal of Deputy Vice President Rossone, to request the intervention of the Bank of Italy, with a commissioner, removing Roberto Calvi from any position, thus also revoking his powers of attorney. The meeting is not over yet. A thud is heard in the inner courtyard of Banco Ambrosiano. There are screams, cries for help, help, help. It's the lady. That lady is Graziella Corocero, just over 50 years old. Originally from Conegliano, she is Roberto Calvi's personal secretary. She fell from the 4th floor, leaving a note, cursing Calvi, and asking to use all possible caution to inform her sister, who has a heart condition. Everyone says it was a suicide, but Calvi, when he is informed, seems not to believe it. He believes it's impossible that Corocero jumped, and that's when Calvi perhaps realizes that he is truly in danger, but it's at that moment that Calvi disappears, once again into thin air, only to reappear. A corpse found hanging by a rope tied to a gas pipe under the Fratineri Bridge, to which innocent Poles Lungolt friends. Suicide. Homicide. The first verdict of the English police is suicide. But no one believes it. His wife Clara doesn't believe it. His children don't believe it. Even the Italian magistrates don't believe it. Led by prosecutor Domenico Sica, they traveled to London to investigate. Roberto Calvi couldn't have committed suicide, and how would he have? He's a man of a certain age, he's over 60, and he certainly doesn't have an athletic build. Those bricks, those pieces of masonry that tore through his jacket pockets and were even stuffed into his groin, weighed him down even more. And above all, from the parapet of the riverside, under the Fratineri Bridge, all the way to the scaffolding made of innocenti pipes. It's quite a leap, a jump that even a person in full strength would struggle to make, especially not a man over 60 who is overweight. Why use a bowline knot? People attempting suicide typically use a noose. A noose is supposed to tighten, not just hold a weight. The subsequent investigations carried out by the English police led to a so-called open verdict, meaning they couldn't determine whether it was suicide or murder. It's a bit of a Solomonic solution, but as time goes by, various informants will start to talk. Francesco Marino Manoia will say that Roberto Calvi was killed on the orders of Pippo Calò because he had taken money belonging to the mafia, the Banda Amagliana, and Licio Gelli, money that Calvi was supposed to launder, but he wasn't able to return. Therefore, he would have paid for it with his life. According to Marino Manoia, it would have been the hand of Francesco Di Carlo, a mafioso expelled from the commission and sent to London, to tighten around Calvi's neck, suffocating him, and then staging that macabre story of the hanging. But Francesco Di Carlo says it wasn't him. He admits that Carlo would have called him, asking him to intervene and kill Calvi, but then he would have told him that the matter had ended up in the hands of the Neapolitans. That is, in the hands of the new organized Camorra. Raffaele Cutolo, who would have entrusted his loyal deputy, Vincenzo Casillo, with carrying out Calvi's death sentence. Vincenzo Casillo, Raffaele Cutolo's deputy, it would have been him, who killed Calvi and then hung him under the Fratineri Bridge. But Vincenzo Casillo, as we know, can no longer speak. We've already told his story. He was blown up in a stolen car near Fortebracci in Rome. So how did it really go? The various trials that took place over time never managed to fully shed light on it. On the whole affair, on who killed Calvi, on why Calvi was killed, why Flavio Carboni convinced Roberto Calvi to go to London, Silvano Vittor's true involvement in the affair, along with the roles of the Institute for Religious Works, Paul Casimir Barciakos, Opus Dei, and Licio Gelli's P2. The role of so many people who have been involved in this intricate scenario that is part of the tragic life of Roberto Calvi. People who, in the vast majority of cases, can no longer speak today. Most of them are dead. Carboni died a few weeks ago. Gelli died in December 2015, and Marcinkus died in 2006. As for Vitter, after leaving the trial, he never wanted to speak again. But that's not all. Michele Sindona can't speak either, poisoned in prison. Some say it was suicide. Others say they wanted to finish him off, like Gaspar and Picciota. The poison in the coffee. Even the main players from that Banco Ambrosiano era can't talk. They're all dead. So what do we have left of Roberto Calvi? We're left with doubts about where all that money that disappeared from Banco Ambrosiano ended up. Money that maybe we later found? Panamanian companies that were said to be a safeguard for the Vatican, and money that maybe ended up in Poland. Who knows? Maybe to finance solidarity and to thank John Paul II, who also died now 17 years ago. The mystery remains for me. There remains the sensational collapse of Banco Ambrosiano, which a few weeks after Calvi's death goes into liquidation. Compulsory liquidation, with a pool of banks taking on the liabilities and struggling to start over. A collapse so deep that it left a mark on the history of Italian society and economy, a collapse that bears the mark of the P2, the mark of the mafia. But not only that. A story that is still being resolved today, with the macabre image of that head emerging from the waters of the Thames. That head that looked like a bundle of rags. That head devoid of the color of life. The life of Roberto Calvi, a man who wanted to become the lord of Italian finance. And who made his choice? Probably the wrong friends, the tragic friends, the dangerous friends who led him to a truly horrible end. And in some ways, even today, it still doesn't make sense.